Okay, picture this. The President of the United States suggesting pretty directly that a sitting state governor should be arrested. Sounds wild, right? Like something out of a movie.
Yeah, totally. But this actually happened June 2025. It became this dramatic reality.
Exactly. And today we're diving deep into that, well, frankly, incredibly intense political and legal fight, the one between then President Donald Trump and California Governor Gavin Newsom.
Right. It all started with federal immigration raids, but then it just blew up, escalated massively when federal troops, actual military forces, were sent into Los Angeles.
And to really get our heads around this, we've gathered insights from, well, a whole stack of solid sources for you. We're looking at reports from places like the Times of India, the Economic Times, the Independent, Anadolu Agency, Al Jazeera.
Yeah, plus local views from Spectrum News and the San Francisco Standard, and importantly, official statements from Governor Newsom's office itself.
So our mission really is to pull out the key pieces, the most important bits of info from all this material. We want to give you a clear, kind of concise understanding of what happened, the legal fight, the intense language flying back and forth.
And also some, surprising stuff about what else Governor Newsom was up to behind the scenes. Some other big bites he was picking, all without making your head spin. Okay, let's get into it.
Right. So let's set the stage. Where did this whole confrontation really begin? What was that first spark?
It really kicks off in Los Angeles. We're talking early June 2025. And the specific trigger, that was June 6th. That's when ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, launched these really widespread operations in the city.
And these weren't just like standard procedure. The sources paint a picture of something much more aggressive, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. These raids led to 44 people being detained, and that included minors.
Minors.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And what really stands out is that, according to the reports, only 5 of those people arrested apparently had any kind of criminal history.
5 out of 44.
Right. And the sources consistently use terms like military-style operations. They said these actions inflamed tensions and really sparked panic in the community.
Military style, with so few having criminal records, that does sound incredibly provocative. So how did people in LA react?
Well, understandably, pretty strongly. Protests started up quickly. People were out there demonstrating against the ICE tactics and, the president's whole immigration agenda.
Were these protests peaceful?
Governor Newsom's office made a point of saying they were largely nonviolent.
Yeah.
People exercising their First Amendment rights. But it's important to note the sources do mention some violent and illegal incidents did happen, and state and local police made arrests for those.
Okay, so protests are happening, some incidents, but then the federal response really took things to another level, didn't it? President Trump made some pretty jaw-dropping moves.
He definitely did. I mean, first off, he publicly backed IC Director Tom Homan's threat to actually arrest Governor Newsom.
Arrest a sitting governor. What was the legal justification supposed to be for that?
Well, that's the thing. When asked, Trump was really vague. He basically said Newsom's primary crime is running for governor. He's done such a bad job. Not exactly a legal statute.
Not exactly.
And he didn't just let it go. He actually praised Homan for saying it.
Yeah.
So I think it's great.
Wow. Okay, so the verbal threats escalate. What happened next? What concrete action did Trump take? Because that seems like the really unprecedented part.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
Starting June 7th, Trump ordered thousands of National Guard troops into L.A. It started at 2,000, then went up to 4,000. And on top of that, 700 active-duty U.S. Marines.
Active-duty Marines in a U.S. city.
Yep. And here's the kicker. This was done completely without Governor Newsom's consent. No input sought, nothing. Just a direct bypass of his authority as governor.
That is a massive assertion of federal power over a state. What reason did the president give for sending in the military like that?
Well, Trump accused Newsom of basically obstructing federal immigration enforcement. He blamed Newsom for the chaos and said he had to step in because Newsom failed to stop violence.
Even though Newsom's office said the protests were mostly nonviolent.
Right. And Trump claimed on social media the National Guard had done a great job. But Newsom later shot back that the Guard wasn't even fully deployed yet when Trump tweeted that.
So, conflicting accounts there. What was the official White House line?
White House officials confirmed Trump was serious. They put out statements saying things like no one is above the law and hinted Newsom may face consequences if he got in the way of federal enforcement.
Okay, so facing arrest threats and federal troops in his state, Newsom obviously wasn't going to take this quietly. How did he respond?
His counterattack was immediate and very defiant. Very Newsom, you could say. Reacting to the arrest threat, he famously said, "He knows where to find me. Come and arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy. I don't give a damn."
Strong words.
Very. He also called Holman and Trump's team immature, said they need to grow up and stop bloviating. He even went on X, Twitter, and called the whole thing authoritarian and the acts of a dictator, not a president.
And he didn't hold back on condemning the troop deployment itself, did he? What were his main criticisms there?
No, he went all out. He called it un-American, a threat to civilian safety, even a deranged fantasy of a dictatorial president. He used terms like illegal, unconstitutional, and unmistakable step toward authoritarianism.
He really framed it as a fundamental threat.
Yeah, he added, "This is a day I hoped I'd never see in America. This is a line we cannot cross." He basically painted Trump as the one causing the chaos, not solving it.
Saying Trump lit the match.
Exactly. That Trump had lit the match and exacerbated the situation. Newsom insisted local and state law enforcement had things under control and hadn't asked for any federal help. He flat out accused Trump of lying about coordination and what was actually happening on the ground.
So this war of words quickly turned into a legal battle. Newsom and his Attorney General, Rob Bonta, they moved fast, right?
Super fast. By June 9th, they'd filed a lawsuit. It was against President Trump, the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and the Department of Defense.
And what was the core legal argument?
The main charge was that Trump violated the U.S. Constitution, specifically his Title X authority. That's the part dealing with presidential power over federal military forces and federalizing the National Guard. They argued it was an illegal takeover of the California National Guard unit because it happened without the governor's okay, which they said was required, and that it was totally unwarranted by the situation.
And they used Trump's own past statements in the lawsuit, didn't they? That's quite a move.
Yeah, pretty clever. The lawsuit pointed to a 2020 town hall where Trump himself said he couldn't just send the National Guard into Democratic-run cities without the governor's approval.
Kind of hoisted by his own petard there.
Sort of. And the lawsuit also noted the federalization order wasn't even specific just to California, which raised this bigger worry that the president might think he could just take control of any state's militia anytime he wanted.
And there was another layer to the lawsuit, too, about what the Guard might be asked to do.
Right. Newsom and Bonta alleged the Defense Department had actually expanded Cal Guard's duties to include helping ICE agents with civilian law enforcement, things like arresting and detaining immigrants. Newsom called that a direct violation of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, so lawsuit filed. The courts then got involved, and things got complicated, legally speaking. What happened first?
Well, initially it looked like a win for Newsom. On June 12th, a federal judge, U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer, sided with California. He ordered Trump to return control of the California National Guard to Newsom, calling the deployment illegal.
A clear victory, it seems. But it didn't last long.
Nope, just 8 days. On June 20th, things flipped. The Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, based in San Francisco, reversed Judge Breyer's ruling.
Reversed it? On what grounds?
The appeals panel, and it's maybe worth noting, it had 2 Trump appointees and 1 Democratic appointee ruled that Trump likely acted within his authority when he federalized the Guard.
Why? What was their reasoning?
Their reasoning was that the president could federalize the Guard to protect federal personnel performing federal functions and to protect federal property.
Even without the governor's specific sign-off through the usual channels?
Exactly. The court said Trump's failure to issue the federalization order directly through the governor of California does not limit his otherwise lawful authority. Basically, the technical procedure didn't override the president's perceived authority in this context.
But was it a total win for the Trump administration in the appeals court?
Not entirely. There was a nuance. The appeals court disagreed with the administration's argument that the president's decision was totally immune from judicial review. They said, nope, courts can look at this.
So the fight wasn't necessarily over.
Right. The court noted Newsom could still potentially challenge the use of the Guard and the Marines under other laws, like the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally bars using federal troops for domestic law enforcement.
So how did Governor Newsom react to this appeals court setback? Did he back down?
Not a chance. He immediately posted online that the legal challenge would continue. He said, Donald Trump is not a king and not above the law. He pointed out the court did reject Trump's claim he could do whatever he wanted without judicial oversight. Newsom vowed, we will not let this authoritarian use of military soldiers against citizens go unchecked.
Okay, so that federal battle was clearly intense and ongoing. But what's really interesting, maybe even kind of surprising, is what else Newsom was tackling at the exact same time. You mentioned he was in another big fight.
That's right. It's fascinating. While all this public drama with Trump was unfolding, Newsom was deep in another high-stakes political battle back home. Around July 4th, 2025, he made a major move to reform the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA.
CQQ, okay, that's a big one in California politics. Why did it need reforming? What was the issue there?
Well, CQA was originally meant to protect the environment, obviously. But over time, it had kind of become this tool, weaponized, as one source put it, by opponents of new housing projects. It led to these massive delays and huge costs.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, the sources had a good one. A plan for just 60 homes near public transit in Palo Alto ended up needing 10 different technical reports. It took years and cost tens of thousands of dollars just for the paperwork. Meanwhile, another much larger project on open wetlands apparently required fewer reports. The system seemed broken, almost backwards.
Okay, so a real problem holding back housing. How did Newsom try to fix it, especially if there was legislative resistance, which there usually is with CEQA?
He went for, let's call it the nuclear option. The source described it as Newsom putting a figurative gun to the head of the state assembly.
Whoa.
He threatened a total government shutdown. We're talking withholding funding for police, for fire departments, even threatening to stop paychecks for the elected officials themselves if they didn't pass bills to make building housing easier.
That is extreme. Did it work?
It did. Apparently, that unprecedented level of pressure broke the logjam. Reforms were passed, aimed at unlocking what they called a wave of desperately needed new housing. Some estimates suggested tens of thousands of new homes could get built, making, real progress for low-income Californians.
Incredible result, but I bet those tactics ruffled some feathers. How is that perceived? Threatening a shutdown.
Oh yeah, definitely controversial. Some groups, like the Sierra Club, were quoted comparing Newsom's tactics to a dictator. But the source we looked at also argued it might have been the most democratic move possible because it benefited people often left out of the process, people who are too busy or too poor to have representation fighting against anti-housing interests. It really sparks a debate about tactics versus outcomes.
And did the sources mention anything else affecting California's housing costs around that time, beyond just CQA?
They did briefly touch on it. Mentioned high interest rates, making building expensive, a shortage of immigrant labor, which the article attributed to President Trump's policies, and also tariffs on steel and lumber, which were also attributed to Trump, the 47th president. So a mix of factors.
Okay, so if you step back and look at both these huge fights, the massive public showdown with Trump over federal power and this simultaneous bare-knuckle fight over state housing policy, it really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows Newsom's willingness to use some serious leverage to take on really powerful interests, not just Trump on the national stage, but also entrenched interests within California on something as critical as housing. One source even said it showed that dog in him for fighting for California's future.
So, pulling this all together, what does this deep dive really tell us? What should you, the listener, take away from this?
Well, I think first, it throws that tension between state and federal power into really sharp relief, especially when you bring the military into domestic situations and immigration enforcement. You see how different reads on the Constitution can lead to these real-world clashes, these major legal battles.
Yeah, it's not just theoretical. And it also shows how political leaders like Newsom here have to juggle these massive public confrontations like with Trump while also trying to push through major, sometimes painful domestic policy changes like the housing reform, even if it means using pretty drastic measures.
Which leads to that really fundamental question, doesn't it? When does using that kind of extreme political leverage, whether it's a president sending troops without consent or a governor threatening a shutdown, cross the line into becoming, as Newsom put it, an unmistakable step toward authoritarianism? And when, if ever, is it actually a necessary, maybe even courageous, act of leadership for people who need help?
That's the core tension, isn't it? This whole episode in California back in June 2025, it's just such a vivid example of that ongoing struggle over power in our federal system. It really makes you think about the limits of executive power, both federal and state, and how much we rely on the courts to try and sort these incredibly high-stakes fights out.
Absolutely. And beyond just the headlines of Trump versus Newsom, what does it signal for democracy when you have a president calling for a governor's arrest, or a governor feeling the need to threaten to shut down his own government to get policy passed? It's that kind of intense, almost existential conflict playing out through executive orders and lawsuits that really forces you to grapple with the long-term health of checks and balances in the U.S. Makes you wonder where things go from there.